All right, well, I'm going to get us started and we can give people more minutes to join while I introduce this webinar, this briefing, myself, and our wonderful panelists today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lauren Draper. I am CMEP's Middle East and Communications Coordinator. I am based out of East Jerusalem. So good afternoon or evening to those of you also joining from the Middle East. Very grateful to be here with you all for this wonderful event, for this special briefing and reflections from the May 2024 travel to Palestine, Israel, and Jordan from CMEP staff leadership and also our executive sort of board members. So very grateful to have everyone here. In our panel today, we have three wonderful panelists, the first of which is my colleague, Reverend Dr. Mayalise Cannon, CMEP Executive Director. So she will be sharing about her travels. We also have Reverend William Young here, who is a CMEP board member representing the American Baptist Churches, USA. And so we're very grateful to have you here. Reverend Young joined us in Palestine for the Christ at the Checkpoint Conference and is the pastor of the Covenant Baptist United Church of Christ. So very grateful to have you here. I also want to introduce Reverend Nate Hosler, who is also a CMEP board member and was a part of our delegation in Israel and Palestine. He serves as the pastor of the congregation in Washington, D.C., and is a CMEP board member for the Church of the Brethren. So very grateful to have you all here. We're going to start with our panelist, Reverend Nathan Hosler, and he will share a few opening remarks. Reverend Nathan is actually joining us in the car today. And so because of some car troubles and tech troubles, we're going to be sharing a pre-recorded message from Nate, but he is here in the call. So he'll be here to answer questions a little bit later on. So I'm going to pass it now over to Nathan's portion.
Hello, I'm Reverend Dr. Nathan Hosler from the Church of the Brethren, direct our Washington, D.C. office called the Office of Peace Building Policy. I've been on Churches Middle East Pieces board for about 12 years and recently traveled to Israel and Palestine as part of a small delegation to attend the Christ at the Checkpoint Conference. This past Sunday's lectionary passages included a passage from Lamentations chapter 3, verses 22 to 32. This in part reads, "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. God's mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." One of the significant things I noticed and observed both at the conference and throughout this trip, particularly when talking with Palestinian Christians, was that both their steadfastness, often referred to as samud, as well as God's faithfulness, even despite the very significant challenges that have only increased in the past months. As part of this, near the end, I was able to travel near to Gaza, to the Gaza envelope. We visited the settlement of Sderot and were able to be on a hilltop overlooking northern Gaza. As we looked into the distance, we could see buildings, and they're far enough away that they looked like buildings. You could see structures and lines of a place where people had been or were currently living. There were binoculars there, and as we looked through the binoculars, and I'll share my screen briefly, what came into focus is what you see here. They were not rows of standing buildings, but lines and lines of destruction. From this vantage point, we could see a little bit of smoke and dust, not a whole lot, but later on, from where we were a little bit further south, we could both hear the ongoing bombing and artillery and drones. Part of this, seeing this, and I noted here both its notability, we've seen pictures like this, but seeing close and also in conversation with those who experienced the October 7th attacks directly, and then the ongoing attacks both in Gaza and in the West Bank, painted a very difficult picture. So as noted, we visited the edge of Gaza and it came into focus as we talked with Palestinian Christians and Palestinians. It was obvious that they were very clear-eyed what was happening in Gaza and all of Palestine. We heard repeatedly of families consistently leaving and more families leaving from when we were in Bethlehem. We hear of both lately in the news here, but particularly there we heard of increased and unchecked settler violence. that is both not addressed and also not protected against. We also heard what was notable, that settlers from the US are often the most violent, and that the ongoing occupation has led to this increased disappearance of the Christian community, particularly in Gaza, but all of Palestine. Pastor Munther Isaac of Bethlehem Bible College and the Christmas Church, Lutheran Church in Bethlehem, asserted, in Gaza they have taken nearly everything, but they cannot get inside and take our faith in a just and good God. Much of my work in the policy world here in Washington, D.C. is addressing issues of conflict and violence and war. So I feel like often what I'm doing and working to do is trying to stop bad things from happening or U.S. contributing to them. I was challenged particularly listening to Lama Mansour, a Palestinian Christian resident of Israel, powerfully address the Christ the Checkpoint Conference, and note that from a position of vulnerability and grief, she stated, "Hope gives power to imagine. We are hope-shaped creatures. If we fail to imagine, others will fill the gap." I was challenged in this both by the ongoing persistence of the Palestinian Christians and broader community, as well as this articulation of the need to both remember the faithfulness and justice of God, as well as imagine a future that is different. Another thing that I found particularly notable and memorable was visiting with Yusuf Daher of the World Council of Churches in Jerusalem. Now, again, much of my work is with the Church of the Brethren's policy office, and so I often been thinking in terms of policies and systems and systemically. And one thing that Yusuf noted that may feel obvious, or maybe should have been obvious since I'm also a pastor, was the importance of relationships, particularly for Palestinian Christians feeling abandoned by the churches in the West. He noted that they have received very few guests, very few visitors. People, if they visit, often visit just the holy sites, the sites that are important, but not the only presence. And he noted the the ongoing significance, both pastorally and relationally, and in solidarity of visiting. This was part of the reason for going. We were called and invited to participate, to be present, to hear, to share with, to pray with, to worship with. I look forward to hearing from other panelists and look forward to a conversation after this. Thank you.
Wonderful. It's always great to hear from Reverend Nathan, and we're grateful for your words. He is here and will be joining us for the question and answer after this, which is a brief reminder that this is an active discussion and we would love to hear from you and hear your questions and anything that this briefing sparks. So if you do have those questions at the bottom of your screen, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A feature rather than using the chat feature, and that will help us to ask those directly to the panelist after this time. I'd now like to welcome Reverend Young to speak briefly about and sort of give us some opening remarks.
Thank you, Lauren. It's a pleasure to be in this panel, this webinar. Grateful for the opportunity to have gone to this. I guess was my second time going to this particular conference in Bethlehem, and I suppose I greatly appreciate the aspirations behind Christ at the Checkpoint over the years. It's designed specifically for Western Christians, and especially evangelical Christians, to give the Western Christian community the opportunity to, as they say, come and see. That's what they always say to us. Just come and see the experience of Palestinians beyond the propaganda that we have been fed in on this side of the world. And another design of this conference is to challenge the theological thinking that has cultivated the apartheid state as we see is present there. One of the most impactful things that one of the most impactful themes that ran throughout this conference for me was the criticisms, the justified criticisms of Western evangelical Christianity, especially in the American context. One great theme that ran through this meeting, and as well, I attended with our executive director. We attended the Global Anti-Apartheid Conference in Johannesburg earlier that month, and so I noticed a large theme in both of those conferences being the many ways in which America has blood on our hands in regard to the war on Gaza. Of course, the efforts and the activism and the solidarity of South Africa was highly honored and appreciated in both conferences. But one couldn't help but notice the extent in which the global community is very disappointed in the American Christian community. And particularly one of the things that were on the proverbial chopping block was how we have interpreted the Bible, and how that is central to the ongoing tragedy in Israel. From talking about the book of Joshua, were a couple of conversations about the book of Joshua as Mitri Raheb. He wasn't at the conference, but his name was very much reminded to us, and as well as his scholarship in calling the book of Joshua the blueprint par excellence for settler colonialism. So we talked about instances like that in the Bible, as well as the way Netanyahu justifies Israeli dominance and Palestinian subjugation by quoting Old Testament scriptures, particularly 1 Samuel chapter 15, dealing with Amalek and all of that. So we heavily discussed the ways in which our hermeneutical universe has created this violence toward another race of people. And indeed, as one of the most impactful presentations, I think, came from a Palestinian scholar based in Aberdeen, Scotland, Tony Dyke. And he stated in his presentation, if it wasn't for the theology and the activism of evangelicals in the West, especially in the United Kingdom and the United States, the Zionist colonial project would have never succeeded. And I think of that, and I think of the work in particular that our executive director, I'm not trying to toot her horn, but the work that our executive director has been doing even before the war began in regards of connecting with the white evangelical community on this issue. It's been so important, and might I add, it has been a piece of a bold piece of anti-racist teaching that has been going on in our nation and in our world right now. Which brings me to another impactful theme of this Christ at the Checkpoint conference this year, more than last time. I don't think the issue of race was talked about as much at the last conference I attended as it was this particular year. And certainly anybody, who comes from a culture that knows the pain of discrimination and racial prejudice can feel upon entering Tel Aviv airport, as I did. I know some went through Jordan, but I went through Tel Aviv. But you can feel the from you from when you go in the dark similarities of between how Israeli society is set up there and our own history of setting up society. And several scholars, including our dear friend Dr. Munter Isaac, were quick to point out the parallels between Israeli injustice and Jim Crow. And I know, I think that was very important for the largely white Western audience to hear that. I know there's a line of thought in our country these days that Jim Crow was good for African Americans, but I can assure you that it was not. And I appreciated greatly that connection and the need for many of the American delegation to hear that. And I felt as a small group of African Americans who attended that conference, that it was important that to hear that our theologies, our approaches to missions still have racial implications. And so often I have to say, white folks look with pity, can tend to have pity on what's going on beyond their community, beyond their nation, but then have no feeling, no desire to connect the dots with how people of color are treated in their own context. And so it was very important, I felt, to hear Palestinians talk about racism, to talk about white supremacy, as so often the language that was the language that was used. I attended I think I was the only one amongst us here that attended the workshop that was held specifically for Americans, for the American delegation, led by the Sabeel Network, for us to sit down and talk about strategies for the way forward. And I did go, and this was largely a white affair, white evangelicals in the room. And I can't say that I was the only Black face in that workshop. And when you're the only Black face in the room, you tend to notice things that aren't noticeable with the naked eye, as my science teacher would say. And as we were talking about particular themes to make in our witness and our teaching and even our preaching, we were talking about ways to engage with our community. What themes do we bring out when we talk about what's going on? And I was actually surprised to hear things that people who had been engaged with this work since October at least have been saying, the themes like, emphasizing genocide and emphasizing apartheid, which is something I know a lot of churches are still, on the fence about even using the language. And yet the evangelicals in the room were quite okay with saying, we're going to go back to our churches and talk about this is genocide. So I was very interested and excited about that. They talked about emphasizing that there are Palestinian Christians who are suffering in this war, the need for humanitarian aid, raise the theme that Israel is not democratic. I mean, these were some pretty radical thinking evangelicals in this room as we talked. And so I was actually quite surprised at how strong their responses were. And I wonder as well, are they going to act on that boldness? And we spent that whole time, about 2 hours, talking about all the things that we can say and do in America when we get back. And as we came to the end of the session, the last 5 minutes, I noticed that one thing that most of the panelists had laid claim to, had brought to our attention, had not been said in this the whole 1 hour and 55 minutes with this group of largely white evangelicals. And so at the end, as they were getting ready to wrap up, I had to say something, because it had been said throughout the whole conference at that point. And so I brought to them, we've got to talk about how this is an extension of white supremacy. No white face had yet said that in the room. That what is going on here, the oppression that the Palestinians know, is racism. It is white supremacy. They say so. And this is something that South African leaders can see so clearly, and yet it is so harder for us in the American context to see it, given all of our history. And as I said to them, as I said to that audience of white evangelicals, I preach against white supremacy every Sunday as pastor of a Black church. But until white churches begin to speak boldly against white supremacy and their complicity in it, we cannot even begin to envision a sustainable peace there in that land or anywhere else. And so the witness this year, I think, was so very important. And though in some ways it may have been a little bit too little too late, I noticed that there were so many more delegates to this conference than the one I last attended 2 years ago with a small delegation of American Baptists. But upon leaving there, I felt a strong sense in which the global church is really waiting and wanting the Western church to wake up, to change, and particularly the American church to change our theology, change our thinking, our perception of the other as it pertains to Israel, Palestine, and to take risks if we need to say what we are afraid to say in our public spaces, because that is where the impact it needs to be made. Say it in our pulpits, make it a point in our teaching. But some of my most precious memories as I wrap up, one is going to the Syrian Orthodox Church, St. Mark's Syrian Orthodox Church there, which is actually the site of the Upper Room, the site of Maundy Thursday and Pentecost. I met with this gentleman here, Reverend Darrell Bolus, who is a young priest who is there at the Orthodox Church. But he is also a scholar who is reviving the Aramaic language. And so being the geek that I am, I was very enticed by his presentation there in one of the sanctuaries of St. Mark's, and he even wrote my full name in Aramaic, and that's what you see right there. I put that in my pastoral vestry as a almost badge of honor. Another memory is going to visit the Lajee Center, the Ida Center, which is part of the UN UNRWA network, and we got to hear some of the things that they are being able to do in spite of the restrictions that our nation and other nations have made on humanitarian aid toward UNRWA. So it was wonderful to and hopeful to be there. This is one of the students at Bethlehem Bible College, a good friend and brother, Anthony Gier. He preached to our congregation when he was working with the Mennonites in Washington, D.C. And shortly before where he had to go back, he preached to our congregation last August. And I was so grateful to see him, that he is alive and well, and that he just graduated a few weeks ago from Bethlehem Bible College. So we're very excited and proud of him. A great preacher he is, by the way. And then I got to see this guy, Jack Giacomin. He is one of the carpenters in Bethlehem. And I got to meet him my first trip to Bethlehem about 6 years ago. And so it was great to see him and to buy some things from him. But my most precious memory is the peace pilgrimage that we had on that Saturday, walking through the streets of Jerusalem, Old Jerusalem, and being asked to lead in the procession. And as a choice, and I'm grateful that May trusted me enough to make my own choice of song, and we sang an old spiritual, "Satan, we're going to tear your kingdom down. You've been building your kingdom all over this land. Satan, we're going to tear your kingdom down." And someone had said to me that they had never experienced singing a Black song, Black spiritual, anything, gospel, in the streets of Jerusalem. And so that was something, a seminal moment for me to in some small way connect my culture, my community with Jerusalem. So this was a very thought-provoking trip on many levels, and I was grateful to be a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Young, for sharing and for your insights. I look forward to asking you a few questions in a minute. But before we do so, I'd like to hand it over now to Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon, who's the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace, who was on this delegation and also was a part of a journey to Jordan before she was in Israel, Palestine. So May, I'd love to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Lauren. Well, one of my favorite moments was you, Reverend Young, leading us in song, and Bishop Shomali walking through the old city of Jerusalem from the Armenian Quarter. And, we're singing these spiritual songs about tearing down Satan's kingdom. And I just felt, it felt like, I don't know, it felt really powerful and beautiful, and not much feels that way these days. And so thank you for that. And if you haven't heard Reverend Young sing, it ushers in a little bit of the kingdom of heaven. And so I'm very grateful for that, and grateful to have the opportunity to be with you and others at Christ at the Checkpoint. And I also was grateful to be in the region after being in South Africa and being with leaders of the anti-apartheid movement. And I think one of the things that's so profound about Palestinian Christians, in particular in this moment, is their continual call to nonviolence in the middle of so much violence being perpetrated against the Palestinian people. I mean, we see this overtly in Gaza, but the West Bank in so many ways. The death toll right now in the West Bank has surpassed 525 people since October 7th. The death toll in 2024, this year, has already surpassed the death toll for last year in the West Bank because of incursions by the IDF and subtler violence. And while the world's been paying attention to what's happening in Gaza, so much in the West Bank has been ignored. I know Nate talked about that some. And all the while, Palestinian Christians are still calling for us to follow the teachings of Jesus and the Prince of Peace, and to love our enemy, and to respond with nonviolence. And so being in South Africa, and even returning to, a book that was very influential in my own life, was Nelson Mandela's autobiography, The Long Walk to Freedom. And we've been reading this as the staff team, just excerpts from it, and talking about what's it mean to be an organization that's committed to peace in the middle of such a time of violence and destruction. And I just want to read this quote from Mandela. Nelson Mandela won the Nobel Peace Prize, and yet he ardently believed that it was the role that the oppressor was the one who determined the mechanism by which liberation would be sought. And so he said this, he said, he was giving a speech, and he said, as I condemned the ruthlessness and lawlessness, he's speaking about the apartheid movement and Afrikaners specifically. He said, I stepped across the line. I said the time had passed for passive resistance, and that time had ended. Nonviolence was a useless strategy that could never overturn a white minority regime bent on retaining its power at any cost. I'm going to just read that again. He said that the time for passive resistance had ended, and that nonviolence was a useless strategy that could never overturn a white minority regime bent on retaining its power at any cost. At the end of the day, I said violence was the only weapon that would destroy apartheid, and that we must be prepared in the near future to use that weapon. And he goes on to talk about why he felt like nonviolence had lost its utility. And he talks about how he felt like violence was actually the only answer. And I think it's really important for us to understand, because, we laud Nelson Mandela as this man who, alongside of Bishop Tutu, won this Nobel Peace Prize. And I think often we romanticize the anti-apartheid movement. And so I engaged alongside hearing the call of, Rafat Kassis, and the call of the Kairos movement, and the call of Palestinian Christians to nonviolence has so much more power in the midst of this moment where there is so much violence surrounding it. So I wanted to just share that in light of some of the things that we heard Reverend Young share. I did go from South Africa to Jordan, and one of the things that I heard throughout Jordan and also in Palestine when I was in the occupied territories, and this surprised me the degree to which I heard this from so many people, the idea that there was no end in sight to what's happening in Gaza. And, you know, this was, of course, several weeks ago, but one of the things that many people, regardless of where they were, you know, regardless if it was civil society or even speaking to political actors, was this idea that the war on Gaza would continue for a long period of time. And certainly in subsequent weeks, we heard the Israeli military. I hope to goodness that that is not as loud as it is for me, because they just started doing construction outside of my window. So someone will have to tell me if you can't hear me, because it's an obnoxious noise. So I apologize. But just this idea, oh, you don't hear it. Oh, good. I'm so glad, because it sounds like the world's coming to an end here on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., which it probably is in more ways than one, but that's a different story. Anyway, this idea that the war on Gaza would be going on for a long time was a consistent idea that I heard quite a bit. And part of the idea for why that is that Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to stay in power, and that he needs to have the war on Gaza continue in order to continue to stay in power. And so since that time, 2 people have left the Netanyahu coalition, and 2 more people need to leave for the coalition to fall. And several things have happened in the Israeli government. One of them is that the ultra-Orthodox now are able to be conscripted into the Israeli military. That is new in terms of Israeli law. And so there was a question of whether the ultra-Orthodox in the coalition might step out. They have not as of yet, so that has been a question. And so just the vulnerability of Prime Minister Netanyahu, there are significant protests throughout Israel. Those are some of the things that are, you know, now several weeks later, coming to the surface. Another issue that was discussed quite extensively was that the U.S. theoretically has been putting a lot of pressure. I mean, this is something that the United States government or the Biden administration has articulated, that they have put a lot of pressure on the Israeli government to say that the Israeli military needs to pay attention to and do a better job at minimizing the death of civilians in Gaza. And so one of the things that I heard quite extensively was that more targeted warfare takes longer. And so the war on Gaza would take a longer period of time and would move more slowly because targeted warfare is slower than you know, bombs or munitions that are less targeted. And so that was something else that I wanted to share. I do want to also show a few pictures. So I am going to share my screen. Tell me if you can see what's on my screen right now.
Yes, we can.
Yes. And you really can't hear how obnoxious that noise is?
Not at all. You're good.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that's fabulous news. One of the things, places that I visited in Jordan is called the Widad Kawar Home for Arab Dress and Textile Museum. And this was the first time I'd ever visited this museum. I would encourage you to visit them on Facebook or visit them on social media. This is a place that is dedicated to Palestinian textiles. So this is in Amman, Jordan. And I did not know that during the Second Intifada, when it was illegal for Palestinian flags or Palestinian paraphernalia to be, you know, it was literally against the law to, you know, show a Palestinian flag. Women had clothing, and this was, I mean, you can see these thobes and, you know, the children's clothing and these women's dresses that are nationalistic. And so one of the ways that Palestinians showed resistance was by having flags and nationalistic symbols. You can see, the shape of historic Palestine built into the clothes, or the Palestinian flag there, the colors of Palestine. And so I just wanted to show, I thought this was really beautiful. And they had the colors of Gaza, and all of the different areas of historic Palestine have different colors and different textiles, which was really beautiful. In Jordan, I also had the privilege of meeting with American Friends Service Committee as one of CMEP's member communions. And they also are present in Gaza. This is their Middle East team, or the team that leads Jordan, and some of their staff. And so we had the opportunity to be together. They brief us often, at least once a quarter. They brief the staff now and the CMEP board. And so we had the opportunity to be together, and their staff on the ground in Gaza are just doing incredible work. And I don't know if you heard the news today, but I just a couple of hours ago got the news that there have been evacuation orders for parts of the city of Khan Yunis in South Gaza. And so please be in prayer in that regard, which is just devastating news. But American Friends Service Committee does great, great work. After Jordan, I went to Palestine and spent significant time. Lauren is based there and worked quite diligently. And we did 3 types of meetings. We do meetings with our church leaders and our church partners. This is one of our Anglican priests, Father Fadi from Ramallah. And so we meet with church leaders, and we meet with human rights and NGOs, and then we also meet with political actors. And I won't go through all of the meetings that we had, but I wanted to just show you the types of meetings that we do. And a lot of these meetings are solidarity meetings with the Palestinian church. The sustainability of the church is one of the key focuses of our work. I don't know if you recognize this gentleman. He is the U.S. ambassador to Israel. His name is Ambassador Liu. We did have the opportunity to meet with him to raise our significant concerns and devastation about not only U.S., we say that it's not U.S. complicity, but it's U.S. participation. And so we're calling for the U.S. to stop sending weapons until there is a comprehensive and permanent ceasefire. In terms of what's happening in Gaza, we're calling for the prevention of genocide and end of the ethnic cleansing that's happening there. The return of hostages that are being held in Gaza, but also the release of prisoners. There are thousands of Palestinian prisoners that are held unjustly in Israeli prisons. And so we had a robust conversation with him. These are examples of some of the political meetings. This is the foreign minister of the Palestinian Authority, Varsen, who is an Armenian Palestinian woman, Palestinian Christian, who was a leader in the church before she became the foreign minister of the Palestinian Authority. And one of the things we talked about is the fact that more than 3% of Palestinian Christians in Gaza have been killed since October 7th. Another example of NGOs that we meet with, Catholic Relief Services is an observer on CMEP's board. They were, prior to October 7th, the largest recipient of U.S. aid. They do phenomenal, phenomenal work in Gaza. Please pray for their staff and their work. I just, less than an hour ago, was in touch with their head of office in Gaza, who just said what's happening there right now is just utter craziness. And the fact that they now have been surviving under daily bombardment for 258 days is just unfathomable. That's their head of office in Jerusalem. I mentioned that we meet with the patriarchs and the heads of churches. This is Patriarch Theophilus, who's the head of the Greek Orthodox Church. Considered the first among equals of the 13 heads of churches of Jerusalem, who's one of the church leaders that we met with. And we also meet, with incredible peacemakers. This is Combatants for Peace. The Palestinian side of Combatants for Peace is in this picture, who have committed to laying down arms and to reaching across divides to build peace, which, considering the circumstances, is just quite miraculous and courageous. We also, and Nate mentioned this as well. This is the second time I've been to the region since October 7th. This is the site of the Nova Music Festival. If you're not familiar, it is a place where more than 350 people were killed on October 7th. It was a massacre that day, killed by Hamas or other militants. And so we did spend the day in the Gaza envelope. And so we could see on one hand bombs being dropped on Gaza. We didn't actually watch the bombs falling from the sky, but you could see smoke and you could see some of the things that Reverend Hostler talked about. And this site is 5 kilometers away from the Gaza border. And this is what it looks like today. This is the location of one of the kibbutzim that was attacked on October 7th. And we met with a woman there who, walked us through what happened there on that day. And, I would laud her as an example of someone who's courageous. At the very end of telling us these horrific stories, she talked about some of the things she was experiencing. And she said, I know we will never have peace until Palestinians are free and until we're all free. And so that perspective of knowing that no one will have liberation until everyone has liberation, I think is a perspective that is hard to see in the midst of the current realities. This is I think Nate might have showed you a picture of the border, the one that he showed you through the Outlook. This is what it looks like when you're not looking through, the telescope. This is us with the Gaza border behind us. And I think keeping in mind the 2.3 million people, who are still continuing day by day to live with limited access to water, food, gas, and electricity. The statistics that just came out in the last few days are that 450,000 people are living at the highest level of hunger, according to, there's a 5-point scale, and that the statistics of hunger, that the reports of famine, that the distribution of humanitarian aid is just so severe. And one of the things we've been advocating for with the White House since October 8th is that the idea that this is a humanitarian crisis seems to neglect the fact that it's a man-made humanitarian crisis, which is against international law. And so holding to account the perpetrators, that it's a violation of international law for Israel to cut off and use humanitarian assistance as a weapon of war. And so we have been advocating, for the opening of the Gaza borders and for full access to immediate and adequate humanitarian aid from the very, very beginning. While acknowledging that Gaza has been under a blockade for 16 years, even before those restrictions were put into place after October 7th. So I could go on with, there's so much information we could share from all of those meetings. I see we have quite a few questions, so I think that's probably enough in terms of an overarching summary. But I think maybe we could go to questions and answer now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for starting and for sharing, May. I wondered if I could sort of ask you a question to kick it off, actually, this to the group of the three of you. Which is that I often say that someone could write a PhD dissertation about the difference between the news that's hitting the US and what's actually happening here. And the fact that oftentimes the situation of what you experience here is so different than maybe what you anticipated. And I would be interested to hear if you would be willing to share with this group just something that happened during your time that was sort of unexpected or a contradiction to what you had maybe anticipated coming from the US, given that the US news right now and their reflection of what's happening specifically in Israel, Palestine, is often not indicative of the full story.
Who do you want to go first?
That's a great question. I realized I didn't pin anyone. Why don't we start with you, May, and then I will pass it to Reverend Young.
Okay. I think, one of the things, and I think you and I have talked about this, Lauren, I think one of the things that's so hard to articulate or to put words, to describe is that for people who have lived under military occupation for their entire lives, which is anybody who was born after 1967, that they've become so accustomed to what that daily reality looks like that we use the word normalization, right? I mean, but I think normalization, we often mean something different, but they just have become so accustomed to it that they'll say things are terrible without, but then when you see it, when you're actually experiencing it, when you're there, for those of us who don't live under it, it's a totally different reality. I mean, that was one of the things that just shocked me. I mean, I used to live there in 2010, 2011. And when I was there in January, which this has actually gotten a little bit better since January, but when I was there in January, almost all of the villages in the West Bank, and that is not hyperbolic, almost all of the villages in the West Bank were physically shut down at their entrances and their exits by military closures, right? By like bulldozed, like their entrances and their exits. And so the closures throughout the West Bank, like the ability to just be able to travel and to be able to get in and out of villages, it took 2 hours to get, from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, right? And so those types of things that you just take for granted, or that when you live there, I think, of course, it's difficult to get to and from, or of course checkpoints close because they close all the time. So I think those are the things that don't get translated, right? That it's just hard to put to words what that's like to live under day by day, hour after hour.
Yeah, I would agree with that, May, and certainly for me, you arrived through Jordan, so you had to take that long track across the border. But I came through Tel Aviv, and actually, I was surprised that I was really expecting a little bit more, more tension getting through customs and all of that. And in fact, I talked with a couple of other board members who were worried about the journey, and but before going, but I was surprised that that it wasn't as treacherous as I thought it was going to be. But another thing too, I suppose when you come from, I listened to what May was just saying, but when you come from an experience of oppression, thinking about the normalization of it all, for me, nothing shocked me. It never does, really. Understanding the political dynamics and the and as well the racial dynamics, as I was saying. I suppose what I wrestle with every time I go there is how much oppression is normalized in me, and how much that spirit is embedded into not just that society, but our own. And as I said earlier, until those who have built this society come to realize the extent this society that they have created harms so many. We'll never be able to begin to sort what's going on in Palestine out.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to give Nate a chance to answer if you are available, and if not, we will move on to the next question.
I'm going to try it. I'll speak briefly in case it doesn't come through clearly. I think what I was going to comment on is very similar to what Reverend Young just noted. Even when things feel relatively calm in certain contexts, or you don't see overt violence, the degree of surveillance and control is significant and increasing. So, for example, driving with May, she's like, I used to live here. Now look at the amount of, security presence, Israeli security presence. I wrote a piece recently on use of AI and lethal targeting in Gaza. And for example, in that context, there's essentially a ranking of virtually every civilian on the likelihood of their risk or likelihood of their connection to Hamas. And so the sort of the broad and deep surveillance and control, even when things feel relatively calm in certain contexts.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I want to pivot really quickly to specifically Reverend Cannon and Reverend Young, because one of the questions is about the South African context, and the conversation at Christ at the Checkpoint was often the South African context mirrored onto the Palestinian context, specifically when it comes to conversations of nonviolence and ending this sort of ongoing conflict. The question is essentially, sorry, let me kind of pull it up. The anti-apartheid movement suggested that the college protest movement in partnership with economic sanctions played a major role in dismantling the apartheid system in South Africa. And can you speak at all to the way that might mirror onto the current situation in Palestine as it relates to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza? And I'll pass it maybe to Reverend Young first.
Yeah, I think that in both conferences, one thing I did not say was how much Palestinians and South Africans appreciated the student protests in the United States and in Europe. The boldness of young people and the realization, the realization that where the church is failing to lead, young students are leading the way. And so I think that there was a great sense in which both conferences were in solidarity with the students and were challenging Western churches to be in community with those young people who have been protesting. And that's a message that I'm happy to say that I've been able to bring back since I've been back. Well, we were doing it even before I left during the encampment season at George Washington University here in DC. A group of us young pastors got together and decided to got permission from the leaders of those encampments, but we became sort of unofficial chaplains, just walking around the encampments, talking with folks, talking with students, looking at interactions and all those things, just being a presence. And that is something that if the encampments return in the coming school year, I would hope that churches, religious leaders, pastors who are interested in doing further work will figure out, where their nearest encampments are, and become a sort of chaplaincy group, if those students require it or desire it. But there was definitely a sense in which the student protests kind of mirrored the actions of students during the South African apartheid movement, as well as the students, the sit-ins and all of that during the American Civil Rights Movement. And that was very much lifted up, that connected history in those conferences.
Thank
I
you.
would point people to the Prayers for Peace blog that was put in the chat that's out about the student encampments. I think that's a fabulous resource in that regard. And in terms of the question of strategic nonviolence works best when it coalesces globally, I had the great privilege, my doctorate of ministry, my dissertation advisor was Ron Sider, who was a Mennonite, and one of the leaders, wrote a lot of books about nonviolence. And one of the things he talked about a lot was the way that nonviolence has its greatest efficacy is when a nonviolent movement is able to actually carry death, that it actually has to be able to carry pain and suffering. And so that's what allows a movement to be able to be effective. And so one of the things that we see happen in the occupied Palestinian territories is that there is such a mechanism of control that in villages like Nebi Saleh is a village where there is resistance, that it is so controlled, it's actually shut down. I'm not putting my thumb up, I'm sorry, I don't know why my screen does that on occasion, but in Nebi Saleh, one of the Palestinian villages, there, for years, every Friday, there would be protests, in large part nonviolent. In Palestinian resistance, there's a belief that stone throwing is nonviolent. And in some nonviolent mechanisms, there's the belief that because it's against, weapons like tanks and things like that, that a stone is, not the equivalent of violence against, much larger military prowess. But there's such suppression that there's not room, because leaders of movements, even when it's a nonviolent movement, because of administrative detention, can be put as political prisoners in Israeli prisons. So you have, I think the statistics right now are more than 3,000 Palestinian prisoners are right now being held in administrative detention, which means they're being held without charges being brought against them and without having had any type of trial. And they could be held for up to 10 years. And then that can be renewed according to Israeli military law, for example. And so it's not possible for there to be, large nonviolent movements, they're suppressed as a mechanism of the occupation.
Thank you. We're going to sort of bring this to a close now with this sort of final question. I'm hoping to sum it up with a few other questions that were asked. So one of the questions that was asked is just how can we sort of unify nonviolent movements? And I would just like to encourage you that that's what CMEP really aims to do. And a lot of our partners are across divides, those working for nonviolence and partnership in Israel and in Palestine and throughout the region from a background of different faiths. And so I think that there are organizations out there already doing this work. May put up on the screen a picture of Combatants for Peace, and they're a great organization that's sort of reaching across these sort of lines. And so I just encourage you that these groups do exist and they are reaching across lines, and we're still trying to figure out how we can strategically get together more and do work together better so that we can bring an end to this current violence in Gaza and across the region. I want to bring this to a close, this briefing, by discussing sort of next steps and what people can do and how we can respond to what's happening. So I'd like to ask the final question essentially of what can the U.S. church do to be in solidarity with our siblings in the Holy Land? And one of the questions in that regard is also, what does it mean for loving Jewish peoples as well as Palestinian peoples, those in Israel and in Palestine? And what does that mean to be the church in that way? So if it's all right, I would like to start with Nate first, and then to William, and then we'll finally close with May.
Thanks. Let's see if this works. I just actually dropped this internet. So in my theological tradition, we often don't talk highly of what we do or speak in visible ways. So even, for example, be having Reverend Doctor on this title is very unusual in our context. We don't wear collars, for example, as pastors. One thing I've noticed, both, which I think gets to that question actually around Jewish congregations, as well as in my experience in Palestine, was the importance of a visible presence and people appreciating that. So in this context, particularly my co-pastor has been very active supporting interfaith work that is supporting around, for example, hostages taken on October 7th. And because of that, support of her Jewish colleagues and friends has had more ability to speak in other contexts as well. So I think showing solidarity obviously takes nuance, but also in the context of Palestine, many people, or events here in the US, many people have been very appreciative of when we've shown up wearing collars, which again is very unusual for our context, but the visible presence, visible Christian presence has been highly appreciated in multiple contexts. So though it feels somewhat uncomfortable, that's both showing up and showing up in visible ways that's demonstrates solidarity.
I love that. Let's go to you, Reverend Young.
Yeah, just think about that Jewish question. You know, it's interesting in times like these where you find out who your friends really are, as it were, and in some cases the communities that we've always relied on beyond our own. We come to find out they're really not in one accord with us. And so, and I mean, I even feel this trying to relate with Black churches, you know, the difficulty in talking about these issues, you know, with them because of their thoughts, their theology. But as Nathan has suggested, you know, there is a large community of Jewish organizations and congregations that see what's going on. They're not happy about it, and in fact they have been since October, and even before that, they've been some of the more fierce supporters of Palestine, even more so than the Christian churches. And I would say very simply, you know, get in community with Jewish groups and organizations that do understand the oppression and that are in solidarity with Palestine, either local groups or national groups if you can't find local groups. One of my memories in being in Johannesburg the other month ago now, a couple months ago, was taking part in a Friday evening Shabbat service with some of the Jewish delegation to that conference. A powerful service where they even prayed Kaddish over the victims and the lives that have been lost in Gaza. And so the Jewish support is very strong in supporting Palestinians, and so we should be definitely in community with them. And as far as steps forward, ways forward, one thing that I really hope that so many on the sound of our voice today, and those who will be watching will engage themselves in fiercely, it is in this project of decolonizing our perceptions of Palestine and Palestinians, and decolonizing our relationship with the Bible. With my congregation here in DC, we had a 3-month Bible study series based on Mitri Raheb's most recent book, Decolonizing Palestine. I think for anyone wanting to explore all the for people who are just coming into coming to understand what's going on there and the theologies behind it, ways in which the church has been involved, as well as politics. I think Mitri Raheb's Decolonizing Palestine is a great 101 book for congregations and communities to read and to talk about, and to begin to rethink some of the ways that we have thought about the Bible's relationship to the present geography of Israel. And then on the same line of education, because it is very obvious that for Americans especially, education is so very important and for us right now. And on that, I'll shamelessly promote a webinar that I'm doing through the Alliance of Baptists. I'll put a link up here. It's called The Theologies That Support the Genocide, part of the Alliance of Baptists Continuing the Conversation series. It will be on Zoom on July the 10th, and you can get information right there. So we hope to see you at that conversation.
Thank you. I so appreciate the question about how do we have integrity in terms of responding to what's happening with the ongoing atrocities in Gaza. And I think, we've heard from our Palestinian Christian siblings that the silence of the American church, and not all American churches have been silent, but many are, and how that has been devastating to our brothers and sisters in Christ in the Holy Land. And so when we talk about where is our Christian integrity, I think that our silence has been deafening. And then the question in terms of what does that mean in terms of relationships that churches have with, Jewish neighbors, I think is also a very appropriate one. And I firmly believe that we also need to have integrity. And so the passage that I've been using I started throughout Lent, and I have carried it with me since, is Romans chapter 12, and the whole chapter, but specifically Romans chapter 12, verse 9, where it says, abhor what is evil and cling to what is good. And, condemning death and murder and destruction wherever it is not falsely equivocating differentials in power. And so, when we look at the pictures, or when I talk about the deaths of the Nova music site, where 350 people were killed at that site, that was evil. And to say that that was evil and that that was not of God, or that that grieves the heart of God, is not equivocating the nearly 40,000 deaths that have happened in Gaza, and the people who are continuing to be killed in Gaza every day. And so to not falsely equivocate, but also to still grieve alongside of Jewish, mothers who have lost their children, which is devastating, right? And so when I think about what does it mean, what does it mean to be in relationship with Jewish people in this moment? Where can we stand in solidarity with Jewish people? One of a Jewish rabbi said to me, who is a US rabbi who leads actually a denomination here, a very large Jewish denomination in the United States. And he said, let's join together and work against the expansion of settlements, right? And so, and I thought that was a great idea. I mean, that's one area where Jews and Christians who can stand together against the occupation of the Palestinian people, like, where can we be in alignment together? We can call together for the return of hostages, right? And so where can we work together on common issues like that? In terms of where do we go from here on other issues, just a couple of dates to let you know about. You might have seen in the chat the date of, I was going to say January 21st. We're not in January. I know what month we're in. It's a hot month. It's not January. It is July, but it is July 1st today. So July 21st is a day where we're calling on our member communions, denominations, and all of our churches. If nothing else, please include a prayer for peace, but we're calling it Solidarity Sunday. And so we are going to have resources available and 4 different themes, but Solidarity Sunday, standing with Christians in the Holy Land, praying for peace in Gaza and the Middle East. Solidarity Sunday, calling for a comprehensive and permanent ceasefire. Solidarity Sunday, working together to prevent genocide. And so we're asking if churches would be willing to preach a sermon calling for an end to the war on Gaza, calling for an end to the atrocities that are happening there, that you might be willing to do so. If you're a pastor, or a leader, or ask your pastors and leaders, or if nothing else, ask that there would be a prayer in the bulletin, or have an event after your church service. So we'll have many resources available for churches that will be coming out next week, I think, is when those will be published. So that will be coming very soon. Solidarity Sunday, July 21st. July 24th is when Prime Minister Netanyahu is scheduled to speak before the joint session of Congress. And so we, in partnership with a number of our member denominations, are also doing a prayer service here right on Capitol Hill, 9 a.m. the morning that Netanyahu is set to speak. There will be lots of activities that day, but we want to start the day in prayer, and that's 9 a.m. here in Washington, D.C. So we'd invite you to consider joining us for that. Also, we would invite you, I saw someone mention about traveling to visit on a solidarity pilgrimage to visit our Palestinian Christian brothers and sisters and siblings. And so we have opportunities for you to do so. This November is our End Still We Rise Summit in Jericho, and that's our women's empowerment program. It's led by a Palestinian leadership team for End Still We Rise. And so we have a number of trips around that. We have a women's trip that's traveling. We have a regional coordinator's trip that's open for others that includes men and women. And so we'd invite you to join us on one of those solidarity pilgrimages as well.
Thank you very much. Many, many ways for you to engage. And the church must engage, honestly, at this moment now more than ever. So we invite you, if you have any questions, if you think one of these things might fit a niche in your community, you can also email us at info@cmep.org and have one-on-one conversations with our staff about ways that we could target these events towards your area better or better reach your community, because we're really interested in doing that. So thank you so much, Reverend Young, Reverend Hosler, and Reverend Dr. Cannon for joining us today. It's been an absolute privilege. And thank you all for attending and for hearing about this briefing. It will be recorded and up later today or tomorrow on our YouTube. So please do share it with your community. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you so much. Have a good day.